create a tax system that works for entrepreneurs, ultimately it will create more jobs. It will create more wealth. Now, there's a trickle down then, because victims start to feel like people have been let off. So I think people are very unhappy with the amount of community-based alternative sentencing that we have, rather than people going into custody. And I say when we get into office, because why wouldn't I? There's no if for me. There's no second chance. We're in the last chance saloon. We need to do everything we can to make sure that we take hold of central government when the time comes.
Hello, welcome to the Reform Party podcast. My guest today is quite a remarkable woman. When you hear about her life story, you'll understand just how many barriers and challenges she's had to face. And yet she's overcome them with a spirit of determinism and enthusiasm, which really beggar belief. And you'll hear all about that as we listen to her this afternoon. Her name is Justine Thomas. She's an entrepreneur, former magistrate, and committed Reform UK activist. She's got a reputation for straight talking and lots of common sense. Having served as a magistrate for 7 years, including as a presiding justice, she resigned in October 2025 from the bench, just very recently, to speak openly about law, order, and the political failures holding Britain back. A long-time Conservative in principle, Justine left the Conservative Party in 2022 while still serving as a district councillor, something we'll ask her about today. She had concluded it simply wasn't Conservative enough. And that was when she joined Reform UK. And as we say, she has never looked back. Her public service extends far beyond politics. She was a generalist advisor with the Citizens Advice Bureau. She's served in the Territorial Army, and she's founded an educational NGO supporting schools in rural Botswana. She is the co-founder of a telecoms company that now exports globally. So she's got understanding of what it is to run a business in the UK. And with her 3 decades of real world leadership and operational expertise, I am delighted to welcome her today to the podcast. Hello, Justine.
Hi, Wendy. Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on, Justine, because your background, your story is a real inspiration. And I'd like to understand a bit about how you came to being a member of Reform.
So, well, I came originally from the Conservative Party, I suppose. I was very interested in politics ever since I was a teenager. We had a super inspiring history teacher who actually, looking back, was a real super lefty. But he really, really encouraged conversation, debate, and he really encouraged us to think about history, the world we were living in now, and what we wanted that world to look like in the future. So at that time, Margaret Thatcher was in office. I was very inspired by Margaret Thatcher as a woman. I just thought she was an incredible role model. I guess there was an element of, she seemed to be surrounded by men. So I've got 3 brothers and 3 sisters. The siblings closest to me are all boys. So I suppose you could say I was also surrounded by men as well. So I thought she was a very inspiring person. And what always came across to me was her real deep love of her country and her community, and how she thought families were very, very important, and that family economics and family ties were very much, and good housekeeping were very much at the core of having a successful economy and a successful country. And I really kind of bought into that idea. So that, I guess, took me on my conservative thinking pathway. And that's what got me involved with the Conservative Party. I started campaigning on going out on the campaign trail many, many years ago. Really enjoyed doing that, and then came to live in Norfolk about 15 years ago. And a friend of mine said, oh, you know, you must come and apply to be a candidate. Please come and be a councillor at Broadland District Council. So I applied, I was accepted, stood for election, won the election. And as you say, served for nearly 3 years as a member of the Conservative Party. But I left the Conservative Party in late 2022. I'd been thinking about leaving for a while. I had a very there was a deep cognitive dissonance with what was going on, what the government was doing over the time of the pandemic, and what I felt were true conservative values. And I really, really felt that the actions that the government were taking over the pandemic just did not chime with my fundamental conservative principles, which is community, but is in a small government. So for me, a successful society absolutely has community at the heart of it, but it's about communities supporting themselves. And we did see that a lot, of course, over the pandemic. Nobody's going to argue with that. But the amount of statism and state overreach that came from a party that I thought had at its heart the democratic principles and freedom of the individual, I was just completely dumbfounded by it. And it was just in my core, it was at my soul that this party had now left me. So I will always say to people, if they say, why did you leave the Conservative Party? Well, I'll always say, but I didn't leave the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party left me. So over a period of time, I'd actually been watching Richard Tice on Talk Radio, which I discovered over the pandemic, that channel. And he was doing his Sunday sermon every week at 10 o'clock. And I used to just sit there, having my 2 little boiled eggs and soldiers and thinking, well, I can't disagree with anything that this guy is saying. He really is just talking complete and utter common sense. He really gets me. I get him, he gets me. And the things that he is saying in terms of how we can make things better, how we can control waste and make things better for more people in our society, just seemed to me to be perfectly logical. And so I took the step and I signed on the dotted line and I joined Reform UK. So that was the start. I joined up, and then they made a call out for general election candidates in 2024. So as ever in my life, if there is a call to arms, I will be at the front. So if anybody wants anything, if there's a minor scrap going to happen, I will be there. I'm your gal. If there's going to be a scrap, get me on the phone. So I put my name forward. And of course, at that time, the party was very nascent at that time in terms of being the Reform Party. So I went, did a little, my telephone interviews, was asked a few questions, and then was told, yes, you're going to be the candidate. So unfortunately, my forecasting was very poor because I'd anticipated the general election coming at a particular time, and something in my circumstance had changed, and I was going to be out of the country for 4 weeks. So I thought, well, the right thing to do is let them know and say, look, I think you should find another candidate, because it's not going to go down too well if your candidate isn't actually here during the campaign period. So I stood back, another chap came forward, and then Rishi called the election. So hey ho, that didn't happen, but there'll be another election and there'll be other opportunities in the future. So I then came on board after the general election with my local branch as the secretary. And again, branches, very nascent, just trying to get them started. Genius idea to use the previous GE candidates, get them involved as the branch chairs. So there was an instant sort of set and cohort of people who are very passionate about the party and passionate about growing the party and taking it forward. So I came on board as a secretary. The interim branch chair left, so I was shoehorned into that and have stayed in that role since January until very recently when we had our SGM. So it's quite a big job being the chair, and you're sort of pulled in lots of different directions, and it's quite difficult when you've got a business and a grandchild and lots of other things going on, being a magistrate and all of those other good things. There's only so much that a person, even a street fighter like me, there's only so much that I can do. Even I need to sleep occasionally. So we had our SGM, so stepped into the campaign manager's role, which I'm super excited about. And really, really looking forward to taking that role forward in terms of taking the branch forward, bringing all our candidates along and if we are allowed to have our elections in 2026, making sure that we can win as many seats as possible. Obviously, whether we get the elections in Norfolk is currently up for debate once again. So that remains to be seen.
Justine, your background is quite unusual in some ways, and hearing you speak with the passion, the verve, the enthusiasm, the fighting spirit, I think, oh, you're a woman after my own heart. I love it. It's great to hear it. And it seems that freedom is very much one of your core values. And in fact, that has maybe been part of why you became a Conservative, and in fact why you defected to Reform, in line with the same as many of us feel that we are losing our freedoms. Can you tell to the viewers and listeners a little bit about your personal background? How did you come into, I suppose, an understanding of the law, for example? Tell us a little bit about that. That's really interesting.
Well, if you really want to go back, I used to watch a programme when I was a child called Crown Court. And there may be some people watching this who remember it. And I used to think it was absolutely fascinating. And I thought, oh, well, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be one of those people. So I went away and did some research and said, right, I should be a barrister now then. And I think, very interested in English, in literature, prolific reader, very interested in history. My father was alive during the Second World War. There's quite an age gap. He's passed away now, but he was born in 1931. So he used to fascinate me with stories of what actually happened within World War II. And then, of course, as a child, you will learn about that at school, at secondary school. It was part of the GCSE syllabus. So bringing together history, my love of stories of ancient civilizations, the Greeks, the Romans, and watching Crown Court made me think, well, yeah, that's what I could do. By the time I was 16, I passed my GCSEs. I went to do A-levels. So I've probably started more A-level courses than any other person in the country, because I would start the A-levels, do 4 for 6 weeks, and then think, no, that's absolutely rubbish. And then I'd leave and go off and get a little job somewhere. And then the next term, I would try and go back the January. And I sort of did that 2 years in a row. So it was absolutely hopeless. I clearly was not ready at that time for doing formal education. Maybe wasn't the right thing for me. I gave it my best. I did everything from science to maths to literature. So I became pregnant with my daughter when I was 18. And at that point, I was living with my partner, and she came along. I was at home for a couple of years, and then I had basically, typical low-paid jobs. I worked in a bar, did those sorts of things. And my career, in terms of a career ambitions, had basically been put on the back burner. And bearing in mind that, nobody in my family had a career that really involved academia in the traditional sense. So I am Welsh. My father's side of the family are from a Welsh mining village. They're all miners. Nobody in my family had ever had a degree. So I had my daughter. A couple of years later, a few years later, had my son. And when I was about 25, found myself as a single parent, 2 small children, and working in a nightclub, basically. And I thought, well, I've got to kind of do something different here. I'm supposed to go off and be a barrister. Maybe it's about time I did that. So I went to the University of Derby, went on an access course, where I studied European studies, actually. And that was interesting. It's the only year of my life I've ever been a Europhile. And there's a whole podcast in that itself. So I won't go into any detail on that. Won the European Prize, the European Studies Prize, got to go work in the European Parliament, came out of there a Eurosceptic, went on, read law, won the University Law Prize, which was good going. I'm very proud of that, because I had 2 children under the age of 7, and I actually worked full time. I was working 40 hours a week, and I did my degree course full time as well. So it was an incredible period of time, and my lecturers were amazing. I sometimes took my children to the lectures. It was hilarious, really. Yeah, they still sometimes quote little bits of case law. It's quite funny. So anyway, so came out of university, but unfortunately at that point, if you wanted to become a barrister, you still had to go to London and study. And I didn't have the resources to do it. I didn't have any money. All I had was a load of student debt, and I lived in a rented property. So it was a non-runner. So I went off and I worked in various operational roles. I felt I was duty bound to use that degree for something if it wasn't going to be a career, because I feel if you have a knowledge and skill that you can use for the benefit of other people, I feel it's incumbent upon you to do that. And that is something that I have a sort of inbuilt, what would I call it? A rule that, that I live by, that I would say I've probably had that all my life. It's the whole classic, help other people type of thing. But I have taken it rather to the nth degree. But I went and trained as a generalist advisor for the Citizens Advice Bureau. And it was great having a legal background to do that. Wasn't necessary. And then, worked in various roles. And then I thought, well, it's probably too late for me to be a barrister now. I'd set up a business already. And so I thought, well, actually, why don't I go and see if I can apply to become a magistrate, see if they'll have me. And they did. And I've very, very much enjoyed doing that for the last 7 years. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm very interested in the academic side of what's happening in the justice system, and I have written quite extensively, but I haven't been able to publish anything because I've been being a magistrate. You have to be very careful of being seen to be biased, and the perception is very important, and rightly so. So the next phase for me in terms of my academic background in law and my voluntary work within the field, I guess, is to, take that forward in some way and start writing more about it and expressing more opinions about it, which I can now do with gusto, and which I intend to do with gusto.
Now, it would be very useful, Justine, with your background of a legal background, your life background. You've got some amazing life experience there. You've experienced being a single mum. You've had 2 children under the age of 25. You've studied full-time, worked full-time, and raised your children as a single parent. There'll be people listening to this today who can absolutely relate to that, and perhaps feel that politics isn't something for them. But in a way, what you've done is said, well, actually, politics is for everybody, because we all, as you say, have something to contribute. But I would like to understand that background that you had in law, which then led to you eventually to becoming a magistrate. What do you see as being that the crosshairs, if you like, between reform policy and of course, Reform are developing more and more policies as the days go by on everything to do with illegal and legal migration, but also to do with law and order, and your role as a magistrate. You've seen it from the inside. You've seen it inside the justice system. What can you share with us today about your views about those elements?
I think that if I was to give you a one-liner, my opening line would be: the entire criminal justice system is grossly underfunded. Underfunding is absolutely one of the key problems in terms of delivering justice. So I say delivering justice. Well, who are we delivering justice for? Too often, and what I've seen as a magistrate, is the courts are actually focused on the offender. So in the real life situation, my opinion is that as magistrates, as people who are involved in the justice system, you've got your legal advisors, you've got probation, you've got the police service. There's a whole interagency thing going on. But there is a lot of talk about how we serve victims. But to be brutally honest, I do think that in the moment, at the time, when the police are arresting somebody, when they've got somebody in custody, when they're getting them to the court, when you're in court, when you are on a trial. So as a magistrate, you will sit on a trial. You will decide if the defendant is guilty or not guilty. Okay, well, of course, you're dealing with the facts in front of you, but everything seems set up to do with to make it not easier for the offender, but your mindset is on the offender. And I suppose that's natural, because the victim of any offence is not always sat in front of you sort of waving, are they? You've got them in your mind, but it's the offender who is there front and centre. They're the people in the crosshairs, if you like. So a lot of what magistrates do is around sentencing. So yes, you sit on trials, but most of what I've done would be a sentencing exercises. Now, you know, a victim can send a victim impact statement. It would be very unusual for a victim to come to court, although that did happen to me once in a very high profile case that made the front of all of the newspapers in this part of the world, which was actually very interesting, seeing how it was reported, and actually being in the courtroom was quite different. But it needs to be focused. We need to be focused more on the victims of crime. And to do that, you've got to say, well, what do victims of crime actually need? Well, first and foremost, people who are victims of crime actually need confidence in the police force, because it's the police force who are supposed to go out and catch all the criminals in the first place. So, you know, we've all heard the stories of people saying, well, somebody nicked my iPhone and I rang the police and said, I'm using my Find My iPhone app and I can see where the phone is. And the police are saying, oh, well, we haven't got time. Here's a crime number. You know, the attack on the trains in Peterborough that happened a few weeks ago, the knife wielding person who's alleged to have committed multiple offences was waving a weapon round in a barber's shop. And even though he left, the police gave the person who reported the crime a crime number. I mean, how is this right? This isn't right. You're not focused proactively on who are the actual victims there and then. And there are psychological victims, because that's an awful thing to go through. And I've actually been in an armed robbery, so I do know how frightening it is. I've actually been held up at gunpoint in Zimbabwe as well. So I have been in some quite hairy situations. I just invite odd things. But it's very, you know, even if there's no physical outcome, these situations are very frightening. This is not a victimless offence. And so, you know, we want the police to be proactive. We need police to go and investigate. And there has been a complete loss of faith in the police force, and that T-bones or dovetails into an overarching lack of faith that people have that the justice system will be there to protect them, either if they are a victim, or will manage offenders in a way that protects the public to ensure that they don't become a victim. And I do think that is a big problem with the system at the moment. We've become in terms of sentencing, we've become very obsessed with how things impact the offender. So we had a case, it was the last day that I actually sat in court, and we had a case of two men who'd done a big shoplifting spree at a local Waitrose. And we knew, based on the sentencing guidelines, so everything we do is all within a structure. So you look at the offence, the circumstances of the offence, what harm was caused, how culpable the offenders were, and you have a little matrix. And you plot them on a matrix, and then from there you say, well, what were the aggravating factors of this offence, and what were the mitigating factors of the offence? And from there, that's how you, in broad terms, that's how you determine the sentence. So these two men, having done all of that exercise, the only place that we could find for them was 26 weeks in custody. However, because they have never been into custody before, we've got to adjourn, because we've got to get probation to do a sentencing report that will include a section called the impact of custody. So they look at the impact of custody. Now, There is a very strong argument to say, well, why are you looking at the impact of custody? If you've got a matrix, if you've got a system that has determined that for this offence at this level, the right course of action to fulfill all the purposes of sentencing, which is, punishing people, reparations, rehabilitation, protecting the public, all of those good things. But ultimately, if it says the person's got to go into custody, why are we not just sending them into custody? Are we going to expect a report back then that will say, well, because this is what happens, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, a lot of the time, the report will come back and they'll say, well, this person isn't suitable for custody because they've got a terrible mental health condition, or this person isn't suitable for custody because they've got caring responsibilities. There will be many, many and wide-ranging reasons why it might be said that somebody isn't suitable for custody. But my argument would be then, okay, so let's say, I'll use you as my example, Wendy. So if I come over to your place and murder you in cold blood for no reason, well, you'll be remanded into custody. There'll be no sentencing report to see if you're appropriate to be held in custody. You'll be remanded into custody, and it will be up to the prison service to then take care of your well-being and make sure that you are detained in the appropriate way that's suitable for you based on whatever conditions you've got. But we don't seem to have that, particularly at the lower scale of offending. And I don't have experience of the Crown Court system because I was not part of the judiciary there. But in the Magistrates Court, we're seeing that a lot. So I think there's a trickle down then, because victims start to feel like people have been let off. So I think people are very unhappy with the amount of community-based alternative sentencing that we have, rather than people going into custody. And that's a double-edged sword to me, because pretty much every study I have ever seen would say that sending people to prison does not prevent reoffending. There just isn't a huge amount of evidence to support that premise. But of course, what it does do is it punishes people, and people who commit certain offences have to be punished for those offences. That is the purpose of the justice system. It's not just to say, oh, well, there we are, Fred or Frida, sorry about that, and sorry you were having a bad day, and, you killed Wendy, but no worries, sort of thing. And I'm exaggerating, obviously, but that's where I think people very much feel there are two areas where I think the justice system has let them down. So there's a lack of faith in the police service, non-crime hate incidents, the old classic, what are police actually doing? Why are they not investigating real crimes? And then in terms of the court system, when offenders get to the end of that system, is the sentencing appropriate? Has the victim been really, really taken into account? I would struggle to remember, in all honesty, a single time when a victim impact statement has meant that we have altered a sentence for an offender. I can't see how that happens, because you use the guidelines. And of course, it's good having a victim impact statement, because going back to my earlier comment, that offender is the one right in front of you. So rather than, you have to think of this crime as a, if you like, holistic thing, because you have to think of the victim, and that's what that statement does. And it does remind one of that fact. But I think people do feel let down. We've got a chronic shortage. There's a chronic shortage of money reached into all sorts of things. So there's a shortage of legal advisors in the court system. You can't operate a court without a legal advisor, end of. So if you don't have any legal advisors, the courts cannot operate. It's as simple as that. So you find a situation where you're listing cases for trial in 2027. So somebody's pleaded not guilty. Now, you imagine a much more serious offence. Say it's not shoplifting. Let's say somebody's been raped. So they've made an allegation of rape. Perpetrator has been charged. They've had their first court appearances, but you can't list that for trial for 2 years. What happens in the meantime? Other witnesses may leave, not want to be involved anymore, drop dead, go and live abroad. The victim may then get on with her or his life and then think, well, actually, maybe I don't want to participate now and I don't want to give evidence. They, of course, probably most likely being the primary witness to the offence. and then the trial will fall over. So then we've got somebody who's potentially been guilty of rape or some other very serious offence, and actually it'll never even get to trial. And if it does get to trial, then you've got people relying on witness statements. They can't really remember what happened. Yes, they can refresh their quick look at their statement before they go in. But ultimately, they're not going to be as good witnesses as what they would have been if it had happened 6 months previously. So I think in terms of reform, and to come back to your question, because I could talk to you all day about this.
But you see, this detail that you have is incredibly useful, Justine. There are many people in reform who've got deep specialist knowledge about their chosen subject. And were they to sit as a contestant on Mastermind, they would win on their chosen subject. And you're exactly that kind of candidate who would win on their chosen subject, and probably win on the general knowledge questions as well, given your wide-ranging interest. But this detail is incredibly important, because it's where the rubber hits the road. It's all very well for us to say as reform, we're going to change this, we're going to change that, we're going to alter this, we're going to alter that, we're going to reform this, we're going to reform that. But it starts at the ground level. It starts with people like you who understand how the system works, to say, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about that. But these are the top 3 priorities that we should be focusing on. Yes. And it seems that one of the things you're identifying is actually undermining the role of the magistrate or the judge who might be passing sentencing. And yet later on, the probation service is effectively allowed to overturn that by creating further mitigations in terms of the custody report, such that the original sentence that was due to be imposed upon that criminal is now not able to be imposed. So we have a very broken justice system. And of course, this is where people's faith in law and order in the UK is disintegrating rapidly because of these features. But you know about it, so it's great to hear about it.
Yeah, and if I thank you for that, and if I may just come back, I mean, the probation service, I have a huge amount of respect for the probation service. Probation officers are underpaid, they are overworked. I could not do their job, and they do it with a sort of indomitable spirit that I have to say is quite shocking. I mean, it's amazing. I don't know if shocking is the right word, but I couldn't do that job. So, but they're within their role. You know, what they are doing is they're doing what they're supposed to do. So what I'm saying is no criticism of that service, and it's no criticism of any individual probation officer that I've ever worked with. I have a great admiration for them all, genuinely. But it's about that system. And how can we have a system where these 2 chaps are going to custody? They should be going into custody. They have done something that warrants 26 weeks in custody, and they should be going into custody for 26 weeks. And quite frankly, sending them, and actually what in that particular case, you then have a bail hearing. And of course, the irony is we remanded them into custody because we refused to give them, we didn't find any conditions that would mean that it was acceptable for them to be in the community to mitigate the risks that we felt they posed. So the silly thing is they've actually gone into custody. So, I mean, the whole thing is just completely backward, really. It's sort of logic, but then in a way I can see how people who see this from the outside say, well, you know, that just doesn't make any sense. And I think a further point I would quickly like to make in terms of what reform should be doing. One thing that is happening in our society as a whole, you know, we've had a very, very high trust society for a very long period of time. So just before we started recording, I said to you, I live in a little village and it's like the Archers. When I first moved here and I first got the village leaflet, they have a little section, and the little section says the crimes that have been reported, which is reported back from the community. I call them the community bobby. They won't walk around. There are no pavements where I live, but the community bobby. And there was one crime that month, and it was theft of a plant pot. Now, all sort of very twee and is like being in the Archers, you know. But most of Britain is not like that. I used to live in a very multicultural inner city area in Derby. So I haven't always lived in a place like Ambridge. So I understand what it's like to live in a place that's an inner city place that's got high levels of crime. But what I see now when I go back to Derby, I have relatives who live there. I would have left the milk out on my step where I lived before. Nobody would do that now, because the trust has gone, and the high trust society that we lived in, I think, is ebbing away, and we are moving more towards a low trust society. And part of that is to do with the lack of focus on lower end crime, shoplifting being the classic example, and antisocial behaviour. Now, you can do
or as you said, phone theft in London.
Exactly. I think this was 80,000 last year. I was there just last week. I was gripping onto it for near death. But shoplifting. So in Norfolk, they have made a real effort. The chief constable has made a real effort to actually focus on shoplifting as an offence, because I always find it interesting. People will always say to me, "Well, it's been decriminalised under £200. Nobody gets nicked for shoplifting anymore." Not true. In Norfolk, if you shoplift and it's £1, if there's a police officer, they will nick you and you will come through the court system even for £1. And I've seen it. I've seen £13, £15. It's very, very commonplace for people to come through the system in Norfolk. So I praise the Norfolk Constabulary on that point. And I think it goes to show that if there's a concerted effort to do this, it can be done. Now, of course, we then get those people in the system. Then it's for the rest of the justice system to figure out what to do with them, to try and stop the reoffending behaviour, to punish them, etc., etc. But I do think that part of the problem that we've got is antisocial behaviour, low-level offending, and of course, low-level offending, like partial decriminalisation of cannabis. It's just a gateway. Cannabis is a gateway to stronger drugs. And actually, when you ignore low-level offending, you are providing a gateway to medium-level offending. And people will just think, well, I can get away with that. I will chance my arm and maybe I can get away with this. And I think that's where we're headed. And we've got to deal with low-level offending 100%. I'm very, very, very sure and very passionate about that.
My father-in-law is a retired probation officer.
Right.
So it's very interesting discussing these topics with him. And he would say to me that in his mind, there are three types of offenders, and they're either mad, bad, or sad, most of them. Most of them are male, of course, and but one of the issues that we would often debate and still do continue to debate is the issue of deterrence. And it sounds like, to a certain degree, what you're identifying, Justine, is that the deterrent that used to be present in our society, either because of the old-fashioned Bobby on the beat, or because of even members of the community feeling empowered to be able to address, challenge, not that I would necessarily agree with clips around the ear, but giving, a sort of a clip around the ear, even metaphorically, to a young person who isn't behaving correctly, or is riding their bike on the pavement, or is throwing litter into the road, or is, swearing. These kind of what you might call crimes of social interaction, as much as they are they're not criminality in the strictest sense of the word, but they're antisocial crimes. Now, community members feel much more nervous about challenging them publicly. And we've sort of lost that almost respect for your elders in society as well.
I would agree with that. And I don't know, I think we've gone beyond the point where we'll ever get that back now. I mean, we don't want people getting beaten up in police stations by police officers, but it still happens. That's not remarkable for me to say that. We know it happens. But we don't want children being, beaten by their parents and, those sorts of things. But we've sort of lost this balance. And I think, as you rightly say, people in the wider community don't feel able to challenge children. I mean, gosh, who would be a teacher now, quite frankly? Again, not a job that I could do. I'd be sacked within a day. But I was talking to a lady a few weeks ago, and we were having a similar conversation. And she said something really, really interesting to me. She said, here's the thing. She said, young people have no fear. She said, they don't fear their fathers. They don't fear their priest. they don't fear the police, and they don't fear God. So she was very, ebullient and passionate about this. And I thought, well, if we break that down, you can actually see in terms of society and how it's changed over the last 20, 30, 50 years. So they're not frightened of their fathers. Well, let's break that down. So many more children now live in households where the father is absent. Now, I'm not suggesting that the father will always have a moral authority and should be, like I said, clipping the children round the ear. But that's what really she was saying. And then in terms of their priest, well, how many people now go to church? How many people are God-fearing? And in terms of the police, we don't see the bobbies on the beat. So I think what she was saying, she was trying to say that in our society, these roles within our society that have traditionally served as people who would be some sort of moral and integrity guardians of young people, and would, without the court system, exert some kind of community or family influence on young people to ensure they don't go and endeavour to commit into a life of crime, that those things have gone or are diminished within our society. And I have to say, I can't disagree with that. Less people go to church. There are more people who don't have strong role models. My children's father was still a brilliant role model, even though we were not together. And my father was a fabulous role model for my children. And my children have never been in trouble with the law or any of those things. So I was a single parent. So it's not that you're a single parent. I'm certainly not trying to blame anybody who is, or blame people who don't go to church. But what I'm saying is, as a society, where do young people get their moral guidance from? And if the place that they're getting it from is TikTok or Xbox, if that's all that we've got left to offer them, then as a society, we will become morally bankrupt.
Well, Justine, I think you are in the right party. I think you're singing the hymns of the Reform Party. I'd like to wrap up, but before we do, I'd like to get your thoughts on where you see reform going over the next couple of years. Obviously, we've got local elections in some areas, hopefully in May 2026 and May 2027. The nominal date of the next general election is going to be sometime in 2029, unless something disastrous happens and it has to be brought forward. And we're all, of course, hoping that is the case. Who doesn't want a general election next week? I certainly do. But if you were able to influence policy, given your background, given your knowledge, also we've barely even touched on the fact that you're an entrepreneur and you're running a business. And of course, last week Nigel launched a great new initiative to support businesses in the UK, which is so incredibly needed. But I'd like to understand from you, your political experience, your legal experience, your business experience. What do you think should be the priorities for the party between now and the next general election?
I think in terms of policies, I think the party's absolutely on the right track. The contract from 2024 was great. People do say to me, as a woman in reform, I'm not really sure about reform. They don't seem to have a lot that appeals to me. And I think it's fair in terms of looking at the contract from 2024. There wasn't anything sort of specifically that may appeal to women in the sense of, childcare provision and access to childcare provision and those sorts of things. And I think, that's something that I think we should look at. I would really, really like to see more women getting involved with the party. It's a really safe space. I understand that women typically do not engage with politics as much as men. Reform UK, I suppose, coming from the Brexit Party and, its genesis and how it's grown over the years, is seen as more of a male-dominated party. But of course, it's like people like you and I who are sort of speaking out and getting our faces out there, and think, people can think, well, she's just a sort of normal, average person, actually. So yes, I can go and get involved with that party. But I think in terms of how the party's developing, policy-wise, I just want to see a much less interventionist state. We need productivity in our country. If you want productivity, you've got to encourage entrepreneurship. And to do that, you've got to make the economy right. You've got to create a tax system that works for entrepreneurs. If you create a tax system that works for entrepreneurs, ultimately it will create more jobs. It will create more wealth. Now, I'm no expert in trickle down economics, and I know there are tons of people who'd say that doesn't actually work. But what I know is I'm not going to employ 3 more people in my business because of the NI rise. I'm just not going to do it because it's just too expensive. I'm not going to employ. If you create a tax system that works for entrepreneurs, ultimately it will create more jobs. It will create more wealth. Now, a 17-year-old person, when the minimum wage for that person is the same as somebody who's 35, I'm going to have the 35-year-old with more experience. Thank you very much. So I think in terms of creating economic conditions that ultimately will benefit everybody is really, really important. I think the NHS, I've worked in the NHS. I actually worked for Serco, and I worked in the NHS, and believe it or not, they actually deliver some really, really amazing things in the NHS, or they do get a bad rap. But let's make an NHS, we don't need to privatise the NHS, but why can't we make an NHS that's efficient as the private sector? Collapsing living standards that we've seen, we want to improve living standards for everybody, but we need to get rid of waste in public services. So I think in terms of policies, defence spending, small boats, all of this stuff, that's all going in the right direction. The biggest thing we've got to do, we've got to have the right candidates. We have got to get high quality candidates, because the biggest risk for reform is that we have an election, we have lots of wonderful people who come along and volunteer, but really they either don't understand what the job entails, or they're not actually equipped to do the job. They don't have the right temperament, maybe, or maybe the right interest. So I would say to anybody, if you are considering becoming a councillor, go and find a set of papers from a council agenda, from, say, a planning committee meeting. Go and read all of the papers, then go and find the meeting live streamed on YouTube and sit and watch the meeting. And at the end of that, decide how interested you are in being a councillor, because that will give you an idea of what being a councillor is actually like. What we don't want is have lots of people who are very enthusiastic, but then when they actually get to do the job, find out that potholes aren't really very sexy. Campaigning is very sexy and interesting, and everybody's there with the rosettes, and it's brilliant being a team. But then when you get, all of these papers and you have to read them all and go to all the meetings, maybe less so for some people. So I would urge people to think clearly, but I think it's very much about, we've got to get the right candidates. And of course, again, a topic for another day, we've got to be ready for government. And my personal academic interest is in constitutional law. And of course, what happens in that first 100 days when we take office in 29, 28, 27, who knows? Reform UK has got to be ready. Reform UK has got to be Trump 2, not Trump 1. So I think that's very, very important. And I know that Reform UK, and particularly Danny Kruger, is spearheading all that, isn't he? And sort of making sure that we are going to hit the ground running. And I say when we get into office, because why wouldn't I? There's no if for me. There's no second chance. We're in the last chance saloon. We need to do everything we can to make sure that we take hold of central government when the time comes.
Amazing. Well, Justine, of course, as always, we hope that there are plenty more people like you out there with real world knowledge and experience, down to earth attitudes, and ability to apply your theoretical value based instincts on the ground. And with that, there's no reason why that kind of passion and determination can't translate into government and a very, very successful government. Tough though I think it will be. I think we're facing an uphill battle now, even though the polls are in our favour. I think it's going to be still quite a tough fight. And I think once we win the general election and get into Parliament, I think there's going to be tough roads ahead. But this is why we need people like you, who are tough, who are knowledgeable, and who are obviously determined to make it happen.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It's an uphill journey, but if we stick at it, we will do it. And I really, really believe that. I really, really do believe it.
Amazing. Justine, thank you so much for being my guest today on the podcast. It's been wonderful to meet you
Thank you.
and to
Thank you for
find
the
more about you.
invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, Wendy. Thanks a lot.